Hello, hello everyone. My name is Marek Stefan. I welcome you in an extra episode of Power Talks. In this time, our guest, the special guest, is Patty Jane Geller from Heritage Foundation. She's a specialist in nuclear deterrence and missile defense and senior policy in this American think tank. Hello, Patty.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me.
And today we want to focus about nuclear deterrence and nuclear threats during the current conflict and current crisis on Ukraine, especially the threat of the using of nuclear weapon, non-strategic nuclear weapon by Russia against Ukraine. So my first question to Patty is what American leads, your colleagues in the Heritage Foundation, say about this this current crisis, this possibility, yes, of using by Russia nuclear weapon against Ukraine. What is your private assessment in this?
Absolutely. I mean, here in Washington, in the United States, we're seeing this very question pretty much in the news headlines in the op-ed section every morning. People are weighing in what the possibility is that Russia would use a nuclear weapon. My private assessment is not too different. I think it's probably unlikely at this point, but the possibility is still it's not zero. Russia, we know they have thousands of these non-strategic nuclear weapons that are able to be used on a battlefield for battlefield aims, which is pretty different than the way that the US and the West view nuclear weapons. And Russia has a doctrine in support of nuclear use. If they perceive to be losing in a conventional fight, which kind of appears to be the case, they reserve the right to employ a nuclear weapon. But that said, I can't see a way that this would work in Putin's favor. Using a nuclear weapon on the battlefield, would that actually compel Ukraine to surrender? There are Russians on the battlefield. I'm not sure how much it would help Putin. Plus, there's a good chance that the whole world would turn against him even further. So that's my hope, at least, that Putin will realize that the costs far outweigh the benefits. But the U.S. and NATO are doing the right thing by taking this very seriously.
Okay, Albert, I know that you are the author of the long article about this current nuclear crisis around Ukraine. Uh, you published two pieces of this article on Strategy and Future website. So if you share with us and with our viewers your private assessment very briefly about this the possibility, yes, of the nuclear exchange, nuclear uh, crisis on Ukraine now.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. Again, Marek, always good to see, always good to see Patty Jane. Look, yeah, basically, I concur with what Patty Jane said. There is this famous and abused, I guess, by now quote that stemming back from the 1985 meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev that nuclear war cannot be fought and cannot be won and should never be waged. I don't know if that's the case always, and I don't know if always that will always be the case that there will be no winners in this war. But I suppose at this point in time, at this particular strategic situation and the state of the conflict at this point in time, I don't know how it evolves. Could evolve into a situation where the Russians might be compelled to use nuclear weapons. But at this point in time, I suppose nuclear use by Russia, especially non-strategic nuclear weapons, uh, would only yield losers. I don't think it would significantly improve Russian situation. Depends what they want to achieve. I mean, maybe if they would want to, compel, as a tool of compellence, to use it as a tool of compellence against the Ukrainians, maybe it could help them win the war. But if they will want to compel the Ukrainians, they would have to use it, I would suppose, not as a demonstration strike, but rather to inflict heavy losses on political military leadership and the public in general. They would have to terrorize the society. And even if, and that's a very unlikely scenario, even if that would make the Ukrainians want to or be willing to cease fighting, it would most certainly make Russians lose any semblance of success after the war comes to an end. So they might win the war, but they would definitely lose the peace. The US would be a major loser even if assuming that inadvertent escalation doesn't happen and the US doesn't get drawn into this. But the US would be a major loser there because, a taboo on nuclear use would be broken. The Ukrainians would clearly be a loser because a nuclear war would be waged on their territory and, they're the fall victim to a nuclear attack. So at this point in time, when I don't see an existential threat to Russia, the war is going horribly for them, but I don't think there is an existential threat for, either Putin's regime surviving and even less so for Russia as a state to be existentially threatened. So I concur. I don't see how it could help. At the same time, if I could add, because there were some rumors and some speculation about the nuclear train a couple days ago or a week or two ago. Even though I don't think the Russians were moving non-strategic nuclear weapons from central storage, I can imagine them being more and more prone to signaling that they are willing to escalate. And that in its own right, carries a risk of accidental escalation. I think this is if they would ever move nuclear weapons from central storage, non-strategic warheads, and even if they weren't really looking to use them, the fact that they aren't there always makes the chain of command more shaky, especially that the Russians don't really have solid, or at least that we know of, solid pre-delegation mechanisms and algorithms. So the longer this war lasts, the greater the risk of accidental escalation becomes. But I think it's still fairly remote.
Yeah, we should remember that we have in the same time the strategic exercises, NATO strategic exercises, Standfast, I guess, and in the same time, yes, Standfast noon, yes, and in the same time the Russian exercises, yes, the Thunder. So it might be a problem of the miscalculation, for example, for both sides. But my question to Patty Jane now is what about what do you think about the possible reaction of United States if Russia decided to use non-strategic nuclear weapon against Ukraine? Do you agree with those from strategic elites from United States who's claiming that Washington could decided to use conventional capabilities to respond to those Russia threat? What is your perspective? What is your point of view about this?
Yeah, that's the question of the day, isn't it? How would we respond to a Russian nuclear attack on Ukraine? Because, on the one hand, Ukraine is not a part of NATO. The United States is right to not want to become a real party to the conflict. But on the other hand, breaking the nuclear taboo sends a terrible message that, Putin shouldn't be allowed to get away with. So what we do, I think, will depend largely on the context and the circumstances. Is there a demonstration shot on Ukraine? Is there a shot that kills thousands of Ukrainians? Does radioactive fallout or damage spill over into other NATO states? I think the strength of the response will depend on those factors. I will say that I think the United States has done a good job of keeping our response strategically ambiguous. We don't want to draw red lines and tell Putin exactly what will happen if he uses a nuclear weapon, stating that there will be severe consequences if he does, is the right thing. And I won't say whether a conventional response is the right thing or not. It might be, given the circumstances. But we're right to message that, and we not take that option off the table, because I think the goal of any sort of US-led or NATO-led response needs to be to show Putin that his decision to use a nuclear weapon will only hurt him, and then to show the rest of the world, our other adversaries, China, North Korea, potentially Iran, that there will always be a strong response to the use of nuclear weapon, and that it will not help these dictators achieve their goals.
The current administration in Washington, on the beginning of this conflict, since February 24, avoid the escalation, the mass escalation in this conflict. So, Albert, what do you think about this possibility of the conventional response of United States if Russia decided to use nuclear weapon against Ukraine?
Yes, well, looking at the array of options the US would have to respond to Russian first use, I guess in broad strokes you can list four, where the first one is symmetric, counter-escalation, which is to use the US's own nuclear weapons to maintain or not to allow Russia to achieve escalation dominance in the conflict. That is the first one. I think it can be, without much doubt, taken off the table. It can be taken off the table. I don't think the US would be willing to do this. I don't think, the US clearly doesn't have treaty obligations to Ukraine. It's not Ukraine is not a formal ally of the United States. To be quite honest, even if you look at the Cold War days, where the stakes were far higher than the war in Ukraine for the United States, there are always doubts about credibility of extended deterrence, and that's a natural phenomenon. I mean, the goal, just to mention one. Now, with the asymmetry of stakes between Russia and the US concerning Ukraine, and also asymmetry of capabilities when it comes to non-strategic nuclear weapons between the two. Again, the US right now in its non-strategic nuclear weapons arsenal has around 100 P-61 3 and 4, P-61-3 and 4 versions of, basically gravity bomb, which would have to be delivered by aircraft. It does have AGM-86Bs and stuff like that, but those aren't really appropriate tools. So asymmetry of stakes and capabilities and the risk of continuous escalation would prevent the US from doing that in response. The conventional response, and again, people like I believe General Petraeus mentioned this, and it's been discussed a lot in the US media and across the globe, really. I'm also skeptical about this, to be quite honest. Again, there is a degree of strategic ambiguity and, the circumstantial factors. But, the idea of wiping out the Black Sea Fleet or destroying the particular units that were responsible for the attack, it could either be, I see this as a problem, first of all, because that would clearly mean that US and Russia are at war. And if you remember what President Biden said in early March concerning potential US involvement or no-fly zone, and there is no-fly zone over Ukraine, I understand that perfectly, that there isn't one. He pointed out that doing those things would mean World War III, and the US is not interested in World War III, which is, again, understandable. There is also the risk that, attacking either Black Sea Fleet or attacking the unit that was responsible for the strike, could be taken. I mean, again, when it comes to Russian doctrine, nuclear doctrine released in June 2020, it points out that any attack, conventional attack on nuclear infrastructure of Russia, and there wasn't any, they weren't specific about it being strategic nuclear weapons. It just said nuclear weapons, that any attack of such sort, even if conventional, could warrant a nuclear response. So, and Russians historically have been afraid of the US conventional precision-guided munitions capabilities. I think they were afraid of them in the, conventional first strike, disarming first strike context. So that's a risky escalatory decision. So taking that into account, those two things, first of all, the risk of, further escalation, nuclear escalation, or even if not, being in an open conflict with Russia are things that will serve as brakes for the US response. There are two more courses of action that the US could take. The first one would be to stay the course, simply to to continue supporting Ukraine materially and, in terms of intelligence, imaging, and stuff like that, while not providing a kinetic response. And then the fourth one would be to de-escalate. And I think at the end of the day, should Russians use nuclear weapons, we would be choosing between options 3 and 4 at the end of the day, rather than either conventional or symmetric response.
So, Patty Jane, what do you think about this case of the asymmetric of stake between Russia and United States on Ukraine? Because this is not a new topic. We must remember that during the Cold War, yes, we have a very intense debate in NATO, and of course, you must remember that we have a proliferation of the nuclear weapon inside the NATO, because some of the NATO members, like France, decided to be, self-prepared to nuclear exchange if they under the attack, yes, by this weapon. So now we have a certain different situation in Ukraine, because Ukraine is not a direct ally of the United States. So what is your opinion about this?
Yeah, sure. So just to be clear, you're wondering about the asymmetry between U.S. and Russia and their arsenals, and Ukraine not being an ally?
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely makes the situation tricky, as I discussed, that, Ukraine is a part of NATO. The United States has no obligation to get involved. I think it's probably in the American interest, in the interest of the American people, to avoid, direct conflict with Russia. That being said, a free democratic Ukraine is in the interest of the United States. A Russian nuclear attack against Ukraine or a Russian takeover of Ukraine would have huge problems for European stability, for U.S. economy, and that's precisely the reason why the United States has been investing and providing weaponry to Ukraine this whole time. And I will go back to something Albert mentioned before, which was the U.S. fear of escalation, especially in the very beginning of the war. We heard from Biden administration over and over that we don't want World War III, we don't want war with Russia. That's certainly true, but I fear that we have been a little bit too slow to act and to move to support Ukraine. Time after time, we saw arguments that we should provide Ukraine with more advanced weaponry, and the Biden administration was saying, no, it's too risky. And then 2 months later, they would cave and provide that weaponry. And I've done some writing on why I think that Russia's nuclear threats had something to do with this. It definitely seems like the main purpose of Putin's nuclear threats is something called nuclear coercion. So not just, deterring an attack on Russia, but trying to coerce the U.S. and the West to stay out of the conflict, to not get involved, and to not give Ukraine advanced weaponry. And I feel like that's been working a bit. So just to kind of make the other point, surely we have to keep, try to avoid major escalation, but we also, more importantly, should not be giving in to Russian blackmail, because that's another message we don't want to send to China, North Korea, Iran, that they can merely threaten the United States and get their way.
But you think that the situation could be different if in a White House we have the Republican administration or Trump administration, that in that case, United States could decided to be more tough towards Russia?
Yeah, I do think that's possible. Like I said, the Biden administration has largely been doing the right thing, supporting Ukraine with advanced weaponry. It's just been a little slow to do that. Another case that occurred was the cancellation or the delay of U.S. Minuteman III ICBM tests. In response to Putin's nuclear threats 2 times, the United States canceled one of our own nuclear missile tests out of fear of escalation. And I think that was the wrong move. And I would hope at least that a different administration wouldn't have taken that chance, just because we saw it did nothing to help de-escalate. After the United States canceled an ICBM test back in April, Putin responded with a test of his own ICBM, and that was the Sarmat missile, which is, I think, the largest ICBM in the world that can deliver hypersonic weapons to the United States. That's an example of what I mean when I say it's important that we do not give in to Putin's nuclear blackmail. We have to do things like testing our own nuclear missiles to make sure that they work, and also send a signal that we have strength. We have nuclear weapons too. We haven't heard anything like that out of the Biden administration, and I think it's important to stay strong in the face of nuclear threats.
Mm-hmm. Albert, do you have any question to our special guest? Because Albert is the second host of our podcast,
Right.
the Power Talk. So
I got promoted just now.
Yeah.
Look, yeah, I have plenty because look, yeah, but this even, I guess, goes beyond just nuclear dimension of this conflict and all the dynamic of escalation here. The thing is, because I know the complaints of, for example, restraint community in the U.S., and I know they aren't really all that receptive to the idea of continuing the help. And while this gets criticized in Europe and Poland, especially, again, countries which at the end of the day are client states of the U.S. U.S. is really the security guarantor. At the end of the day, it will be it that has to manage the escalation on the higher rungs of the ladder, which is something that people here don't appreciate. And, we have to get into, other side's shoes. But I see the reason in their complaints. For example, the idea that the US will just keep sending weapons and trying to match the escalation that the Russians do. I'm not talking about nuclear escalation, but we had ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes on Kiev a couple of days ago, and the US decided to provide anti-air defense, and that's a good idea. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't see a grander strategic design here for how to terminate. I don't see a theory of victory. Because at the end of the day, at the end of this path, should conflict continue in this way or even deteriorate for the Russians, the likelihood of Russians actually purposefully releasing nuclear weapons or accidental escalation increases. So do you see, you're in Washington, you're based in Washington, so you have the ear there. Do you see some semblance of theory of victory of what the US wants to achieve and what is the acceptable outcome? What would be, I don't want to use platitudes, but the off-ramp. Do you think the US knows the answer to that at this point in time?
Yeah, that's another great question. I'm honestly not sure if we have an answer. Not sure if we need a good answer either, because, an acceptable outcome is ultimately up to Ukraine. Ukraine will be the ones who dictate whether their goal is to restore all of Ukrainian territory, pre-2014, pre-February 24th. That will ultimately be up to them, and also up to Putin how far he wants to escalate. I do share your concern about a theory of victory, because I've been kind of asking the question of, will it take anything less than a complete defeat on the battlefield for Putin to cave at all? Would he seems willing to escalate this conflict. He already went through partial mobilization. Like you mentioned, what's stopping, what would compel him to accept a diplomatic agreement where he loses territory? He still has the options for full mobilization or to use nuclear weapons. So it's tricky. It's hard to imagine a victory in a way that this ends, but that, in a way, I think that's okay. World War II, for example, we decided we wanted an unconditional surrender by Hitler. And how did we get there? Hitler didn't want to surrender, but we did. In the fog of war, many things could happen. So I think the United States is right to continue with its goal of supporting Ukraine to be able to prevail against Russia and continue to provide the requests by the Ukrainian government as best we can.
Yeah. Also, the thing is, Adolf Hitler went for the wrong Wunderwaffe in the Second World War. I mean, he ignored the potential for developing nuclear weapons and gotten rid of the
Right.
scientists, right? But and another question is, assuming the US is unable to effectively terminate the conflict on conditions that are acceptable to Ukraine and its allies and NATO eastern flank, you see, and I don't know if you caught that, but there was a couple of days ago there was an interview with a Polish president where he said that he raised the possibility of Poland participating in nuclear sharing, and I'm sure the US wasn't happy about this. Like that thing, like nobody was super enthusiastic about this. But I think this underscores fears that Poles have. But also, if you look at South Korea, for example, that debate, it's like a boomerang, right? It keeps coming back about redeploying U.S. nuclear weapons to the peninsula. So, do you see a risk that you will get horizontal proliferation over this and over, in general, over deteriorating security architecture across the globe?
The same topic, the same question is about the Saudi Arabia. Yes, the king of the Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Right. Especially if and when Iran gets a nuclear weapon. But yeah, you're right. I definitely see a concern. I hear this spoken about the most in terms of South Korea. That's something I'm kind of trying to work on. Would it be a good thing to deploy or to have a nuclear sharing agreement in South Korea, to have a nuclear sharing agreement in Poland? I honestly liked hearing those comments from your president. I don't think it made Putin feel very good. So I think that's always a win, regardless of whether we go through with it. But those risks are very real, and there are two parts of it. Part of it is this is happening because of the threats. Of course, in the Pacific, the threats are growing from China and North Korea. In Europe, the threat is growing from Russia, and Europeans are wanting more security, especially states in Eastern Europe like Poland. Then the other part of it is the United States currently doing enough to assure our allies? One thing that I've written a lot about is the proposal to develop a new nuclear capability called the Nuclear Armed Sea Launched Cruise Missile, the SLICM-N. I know we talked about this before, Albert. The purpose of that weapon was to better assure our allies, to have a system that we can deploy, in European and Indo-Pacific seas. And the Biden administration is trying to cancel that program. So I think the solution to the greater security threats and the uneasiness by our allies is not nuclear proliferation, but stronger assurance methods by the United States. And I worry that we're not seeing enough out of the Biden administration to assure our allies, because it's not just that what the United States perceives to be effective to assure our allies. It's how our allies perceive their security and how our adversaries perceive the credibility of U.S. deterrence. So I think that our challenge over the next handful of years will be to figure out, what more the United States can do to provide these security assurances and ensure that our allies don't choose to pursue their own nuclear weapons.
I completely agree. My opinion about the SLICM-N, very much needed. But at the same, and again, I've been dwelling into the restraint community more, and that they do have points often. They really do, which is a painful thing for a Pole to say, but I can see the logic. But isn't the problem here that SLICM would perhaps, ameliorate the problem of asymmetry of capabilities, right? That's a very useful, Obama shouldn't have retired those, but isn't the problem that it answers the problem with asymmetry of capabilities, but at the same time, the problem of stakes and resolve is there and will remain there, and putting a band-aid on it, and it's not really a problem that can be solved, right, at the end of the day. But isn't the problem here that if you put a band-aid on it in terms of extra capabilities, new capabilities, but the asymmetry of stakes and resolve remains there, doesn't it make the situation more hairy and risky, because it provides you with an ability to match some of the escalation, but then you're in a situation where you can have an uncontrollable escalation, up and up and up over all over territories that, clear that are probably less important to you than to the other part that's contesting them. So I mean Taiwan, I mean Ukraine, I even mean the Baltics, isn't that's a very restrained community argument, but and wouldn't it be more stable? Or I don't know if you're optimist or pessimist when it comes to proliferation, but wouldn't the setup be more stable if you did see proliferation in some regions of the world? It's a controversial question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand your logic on Slickum N leading to escalation. What's happening now is that our adversaries are on an upward trajectory in terms of building up their nuclear capabilities. And it certainly doesn't seem like restraint on the United States part is going to stop them. And actually worse, I think, restraint upon the US not doing anything to change our nuclear arsenal in response to Russia's and China's nuclear buildup only sends the message that they can continue building new and more capabilities without any disruptions or without any complaints or consequences. So I think the United States response developing a capability that only might start to help fill this gap. We're not matching Russia or China 1-to-1. We're adding one capability to our nuclear arsenal. I think that would only have a positive impact on nuclear deterrence, because it would, one, enable a more proportional response to a regional or limited use of nuclear weapons, and also, two, it would send a really important signal to our adversaries that if they build up, they can't get away with it, and also to our allies that the United States is actually doing something in addition to help assure them.
Right. And the final one, if I may, I know we're almost out of time, and I think that's an interesting one. I've, of course, like everybody else, I went through national security strategy since it finally gotten released, and many of platitudes, I would imagine, but I'd venture to say. But one interesting thing was a part when it pointed out that by 2030 the US will have to contend with strategic reality where you have three roughly equal nuclear powers in terms of capabilities and numbers, and I think that's an inherently unstable arrangement, right? Because bipolar arrangement is fairly stable, while tripolar, is problematic. So what's your take on this? Is it do you agree with this? How do you think the US will manage the situation?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying the idea that we won't have two nuclear peers until 2030, I think is wrong. I don't know when that was written, because according to US intelligence assessments, China already is a nuclear peer to the US and Russia. They can execute any plausible nuclear employment strategy. Just because they don't have thousands and thousands of more weapons yet doesn't mean they're a peer. So I think that this reality is already here, for one. But yeah, I do agree that this is going to be a massive challenge for the United States. All of our deterrence theory and thinking in the past has been based on two nuclear peers, the US and Russia, or the Soviet Union. And we don't really know how deterrence theory applies to a three nuclear peer dynamic. So I have a paper coming out soon. I'll give myself a shameless plug there that kind of focuses on three things that the US will need to do to address this new three-party dynamic. And two of them are simple. I think we're simply going to need to increase the size of our nuclear arsenal. We're just going to have more nuclear targets to cover now that China is a nuclear peer. And we'll need additional capabilities, designed specifically for the more advancing threat, and the Chinese threat in particular, because currently our capabilities are all designed for a Russian threat. But I think the most important takeaway is the need for the United States to be able to hedge against an uncertain future. Hedging entails things like being able to develop new warheads more quickly, or to be able to upload additional warheads to our current forces more quickly. Things we can't do so well today. And the reason for that is that because at the end of the day, we really don't know what a three-party nuclear dynamic is going to look like. And it's very uncertain. And so I think the solution is we'll need to be able to adjust, move more quickly, be able to change our nuclear force posture or force structure when need be.
So the last question from me to Patty Jane is about the industrial warfare, because We see that the plenty debates in United States and in Europe also about the necessary to prepare to the new conventional industrial war, because now in Ukraine we see that the both sides use the plenty of munitions and tanks and all of military equipment. So the industrial base in Europe and also in United States, it's not prepared to be the side of such a huge conflict, a conventional conflict like this on Ukraine. So if we talk about China challenge, if we talk about the continuation of supporting of Ukraine, you think that in United States have the ability to create a real, or the revenue, the industrial base, military industrial base, which could be a real capable to support the military in a huge military conventional conflict, for example, with Russia or with China.
Yeah, the U.S. defense industrial base is a real problem. Unfortunately, we're kind of at the point where if we wrote a large check to some of our defense contractors, we couldn't really get new capabilities for an order of years, 2 years, 5 years. I think something recently that stood out to me was a potential discussion of adding another THAAD battery, which is a missile defense battery, to South Korea in response to all the North Korean threats. And the answer was kind of like, that'd be great, but we don't even have enough for ourselves right now, and maybe in 5 years. So yeah, I don't think we can rely on a defense industrial base that can pump out new equipment quickly. And I hope that is something that we're able to kind of to resolve, to speed up it before we get into any sort of war, because that's a worrying thing for sure.
Okay. Thank you, Patty Jane. Thank you, Albert, for this conversation. Thank you for your contribution to this discussion. I hope this is it's not last time when we can have an occasion to talk about the current security situation around the world, and about the nuclear deterrence and the nuclear stuff. Thank you once again, and see you later.
All right. Thank you so much.